Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Simon Newell. Overachievers do not negotiate with entropy. Decay is always happening. Pressure is always present. The question is not whether the system will degrade, but whether degradation is governed or ignored. This video is about what serious operators install so entropy does not decide for them. I want to talk about something that almost everyone praises, but very few people actually understand the cost of: being early. Not being wrong, not being reckless, not being undisciplined, just being early. For a long time, I treated being early as kind of a proof. Proof that I saw something others didn't. Proof that my thinking was ahead of the curve. Proof that if I just held long enough, time would eventually validate the decision. And sometimes it did. But what I didn't understand for years is that being early doesn't just delay reward. It changes the entire operating environment you live inside while you wait. And if that environment isn't governed, the cost compounds in ways that don't show up in performance metrics. Nothing went wrong. That was the problem. When you are wrong, feedback is fast. You lose, you adjust, you move on. There's closure. Being early denies you closure. It keeps you in unresolved state for long periods of time. And unresolved states are expensive. I wasn't losing money in obvious ways. My positions weren't blowing up, my thesis weren't collapsing. Markets hadn't invalidated my idea. From the outside, it looked fine. From the inside, something was slowly changing. Capital was tied up longer than planned. Attention was tied up longer than expected. Decision-making bandwidth was quietly shrinking. I wasn't losing capital, I was losing optionality. Every new opportunity had to compete with existing commitments. Not because those commitments were performing exceptionally well, but because I had already invested belief into them. Belief is sticky. Once it's there, it resists replacement. This is where being early becomes dangerous. Being early forces you into a defensive posture. You stop governing exposure and start defending decisions. You explain to yourself why you are still right instead of asking whether the system is still aligned. That shift is subtle, but it's foundational. You don't notice it happening. You just notice that rotating becomes harder. Exiting becomes harder. Changing your mind feels heavier than it should. Not because you are stubborn, but because the cost of being early hasn't been paid structurally. Early conviction creates maintenance load. You don't just hold the position, you maintain the narrative, you track developments, you watch the confirming signals, you monitor discourse, you quietly hope for vindication. All of that consumes energy. That energy doesn't feel like stress. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being serious. It feels like thinking long term. But over time, it accumulates. This is where being early turns into structural drag. The system starts orbiting around past decisions instead of present conditions. Capital stops being fluid. Attention stops being free. You begin to evaluate new opportunities relative to what you are already holding instead of on their own merit. Optionality shrinks without anyone explicitly deciding to shrink it. And the most dangerous part is that nothing is visibly broken. This isn't panic. This isn't fear. This isn't emotional trading. It's slow erosion. I used to tell myself I was being patient, and back then, that patience was the virtue here. That volatility didn't matter, that time would do the work. What I eventually realized is that patience without structure isn't patience at all. It's endurance. Endurance asks you to absorb uncertainty indefinitely without relief. That's not neutral. That has a cost. And that cost shows up in places people don't measure. Your willingness to take fresh risk declines. Your curiosity narrows. Your appetite for change reduces. Not because you are scared, but because you are already busy waiting. This is something almost no one talks about: decision capacity. Capital can be evil, decision capacity cannot. When too much of it is allocated to unresolved positions, everything else slows down. Being early ties up decision capacity far more aggressively than it ties up capital. This is where time frame mixing starts creeping in. Long-term positions start being evaluated through short-term discomfort. Not explicitly, not consciously, but behaviorally. You check prices more often than you should. You feel reactions internally even when you don't act on them. You start noticing noise that was never meant to be relevant. The system hasn't changed. Your proximity to it has. I didn't realize how much mental energy I was spending managing uncertainty instead of managing structure. I thought that was just the cost of doing serious work. In reality, it was the cost of lacking insulation. I had conviction, but no cadence. Belief, but no review. Exposure, but no authority separation. So every fluctuation landed directly on me. There was no buffer between the system and my nervous system. This is where things quietly start to go wrong. Not in the sense of losses, but in the sense of freedom. When you are early, without structure, you lose freedom of action. You can move cleanly, you can't rotate decisively, you can't disengage without feeling like you're betraying your own intelligence. Because now the position isn't just exposure, it's identity. And that's when early conviction becomes a liability. I want to be precise here. The mistake wasn't belief. Belief is necessary. The mistake was timing belief without insulation. The earlier you are, the more governance you need, not more confidence. This is the inversion that took me the longest to understand. I thought if I was early, I just needed to be tougher, more patient, more disciplined. What I actually needed was stricter rules, clearer authority, defined review intervals, explicit invalidation criteria. Without those, patience decays. It doesn't decay loudly. It decays through fatigue, through friction, through subtle shifts in how you interpret new information. You don't abandon the position. You just stop being free. That's the real cost. At some point, I noticed that I was spending more energy maintaining positions than designing my system. I was reacting internally even when I wasn't acting externally. That's when it became obvious that something was structurally wrong. So, I want to shift tone here. I'm not giving advice. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm going to tell you what I no longer allow in my own system. I no longer allow long-term conviction without defined review cadence. If something is meant to be long-term, it must be reviewed on a schedule, not whenever discomfort spikes. I no longer allow exposure without authority separation. Execution does not get to renegotiate design. Once a position is on, it stays on until the system says otherwise. Not until I feel differently. I no longer allow waiting it out without time-based invalidation. If time is the variable, then time must also be part of the logic. Endless waiting is not a strategy. It's avoidance. I no longer allow positions that require constant mental defense. If I have to keep convincing myself the position is already too close. These are not rules for others. They are constraints I place on myself because I've lived the cost of not having them. Being early didn't teach me patience. It taught me that structure decides whether patience compounds or decays. When I look back now, I don't regret being early. I regret being early without governance. I regret assuming that conviction would carry me through uncertainty. Conviction is not a system. Structure is. And that's the real point of this log. Not to warn, not to instruct, not to dramatize, but to name a cost that almost everyone ignores. Being early is not free. If you don't pay for it with structure, you pay for it with optionality, clarity, and freedom. And that's a trade I no longer make. If that helps, down below in the description of the video, you can find the link to the Crypto OS and you can implement all of the rules I'm talking about inside the crypto operating system that I've designed. So it doesn't act just as a theory, but you can practice it as well. I hope that helps. Take care.